Okay, so today we're going to have a look at the Age of Sigmar 4th edition core rules. We've got a full leaked rulebook, and we're just going to work our way through. We're going to avoid some of the stuff that's really obvious or that's exactly the same as the previous rulebook, and we're going to focus on some of the more interesting things and a few of the issues that I think are present in the rules. Could be that I'm wrong about them, but in any case, they're the kind of thing that it'd be great to get cleared up. So that said, let's just get straight into it. So at the start, we're going to skip a lot of the core concepts, tools of war, measuring distance. All this stuff is fairly straightforward. We're going to go straight down to keywords and rules of one. Because there's a little bit about this that I think is really ingenious and is a really nice system. But there are some rules that I've seen that don't make much sense to me given this system. So the bit I want to highlight in this keywords thing, this first section is just explaining that you have keywords, right? They're on the bottom of your war scroll or on the bottom of your abilities. But this second section is explaining that when an ability references these words like run or retreat, it's talking about keywords. So keywords let you know which abilities can be used or which units can be picked as the target for an ability. For example, the charge ability can only be used by a unit if it did not use an ability with the run or retreat keyword earlier in the turn. The single and plural forms of a keyword are synonymous for rules purposes. So this statement is just saying, when it says run or retreat, it means the keywords run or retreat. So we'll have a quick look at that charge ability, the one that was talking about. Charge ability is here. It says, pick a friendly unit that is not in combat and has not used a run or retreat ability this turn to use this ability. Then make a charge roll of 2d6. So when it says run or retreat, there could be an ambiguity where we're not sure whether it's talking about the ability name run or the ability keyword run. But that keyword section is explaining you definitely look at the keyword. You don't look at the name of the ability, you look at the keyword. And this makes sense. For example, there are other abilities like the redeploy ability. Redeploy has the keyword run, but it's not called run, it's called redeploy. But the consequence is, if you redeploy, you can't charge later in the turn. So far, that makes perfect sense. There's not an issue with it. There is an issue with some abilities that I feel like the rules writers might have gotten themselves confused about what is a keyword and what is an ability. So I'm going to have a look at this rules of one, these first two dot points before we move on. A unit cannot use more than one core ability per phase. So all of those charge and run and retreat, those are core abilities. You can't use more than one of them per phase. You also cannot use the same ability more than once per phase unless specified otherwise. So you can't use the charge ability twice in the phase, and you couldn't use retreat and run in the same phase, because even though they're both in the movement phase, they're both core abilities. So you can only use one core ability per phase. But you can't use the same ability in any case, right? So those are the two central restrictions on using abilities. You can't use the same ability more than once, and you can't use a core ability more than once, or you can't use more than one core ability. So given that, there's no other restrictions. This other thing down here is about stacking passive abilities. So there's no other restrictions from rules of one. So we're going to have a look at the doc battle trait here, all out slaughter, and see, given that understanding, what this trait does. Pick a friendly Daughters of Cain infantry unit that is in combat to use this ability. Effect: that unit can use 2 fight abilities this phase. After the first is used, this unit has strike last for the rest of the turn. So initially, when I read this, and when I saw other people read it, the sort of interpretation is pretty obvious. It's a fight twice ability. It lets you fight once, use a fight ability, and then you can use another fight ability later on. So you can fight twice. Right? That's really sensible. The problem is that there's no restriction on using more than one fight ability in the same phase. The only restriction is on using more than one core ability or using the same ability more than once. And noticeably, this battle trait doesn't let you override those restrictions. It only lets you use 2 fight keyworded abilities. So if we have a look at the only fight keyworded ability we've seen, happens to be an ability called fight. But remember, we just clarified that they're not talking about the name of the ability, they're talking about the keyword down here. So they're not talking about run or retreat up there, they're talking about run or retreat down in the keywords. Same thing here. They're not talking about this word, the name fight. They're talking about the ability with the keyword fight. So you can use more than one ability with the keyword fight, but you could already do that. You just couldn't use this ability twice because there's a restriction on using the same ability twice. And you couldn't use 2 core abilities, and this is a core ability. So there's 2 restrictions that prevent you from using this ability twice in a combat phase, and that Daughters of Cain ability doesn't lift either of those restrictions. And in fact, it gives you an ability that you already have. You can already use 2 fight abilities in that phase. So I think the intention here is that when it says fight, this one here isn't talking about the keyword. I think it's talking about the ability, but the rules directly contradict that. They make it very clear that this is the keyword. They're talking about the keyword. When it references it like this, that's the keyword. So maybe the fix is to just put little brackets or something, little quotation marks, the fight abilities, unless this ability is meant to do something else, unless Daughters of Cain somewhere in their book have different fight abilities, and the intention is you can use the normal fight ability, the core fight ability, and some Daughters of Cain version of the fight ability as well. I'm not sure. But from what I can tell, this ability doesn't work. It in any case, doesn't work the way people think it works. So that's the main thing I wanted to point out. Most of the time, the keywords thing works really well, like in the instance of redeploy and charge. It's actually really clear. You just have to pay attention to the keywords that are in the abilities. But because they pretty much always reference keywords, it should be pretty straightforward. It's just that one case that is a bit exceptional. The next thing I wanted to point out was this ability, a unit cannot be affected by the same passive ability more than once at the same time. For example, if a unit is within range of 2 different terrain features that have the cover passive ability, the effect only applies to it once. This is really good. At the moment, we have some weird templating that says like, you'll have a hero and maybe that hero has a 12-inch aura of like +1 attack. And the wording on it will be something like, if a unit is wholly within 12 of a unit with this ability, it gets +1 attack. And that's fairly straightforward, except that the interpretation in 3rd edition is not the ordinary English interpretation. Normally, if you read that, you would think that it's stacked, but we're meant to interpret that as though it doesn't stack. So if you have 2 heroes with an ability like that within 12 inches of a unit, it'll only get +1 attack, even though there are 2 heroes within 12 inches of that unit. And the reason you would normally think it stacks is because you have 2 instances of that ability. So I guess a good analogy might be something like Magic the Gathering. If you had 2 cards that were both, let's say they're both slivers, and they both say sliver creatures get +1/+1. Or they had an ability that said each sliver you control has the ability sliver creatures get +1/+1. I guess that's the more accurate version. So both of these cards have an ability that says each card of this type gets an ability that says +1/+1. Those things stack with each other. So they're both going to have 2 of those abilities, and both of them are going to get +4/+4. In general, stacking like that gets pretty confusing because it looks multiplicatory. If you have multiple instances of a card and they each have an ability, then they each stack that ability onto all of the other cards because that's the way it's worded. But in 3rd edition, for no reason at all, the standard was that we'd interpret that differently. If it said, so long as you're within 12 inches of any unit with this ability, give it +1 attack, then It wouldn't matter if you had 1 copy of it or 6 copies of it. You would only get +1 attack if you were in range of any of them, rather than +6 attacks, because there are 6 instances of that ability that all tell you to give +1 attack. I hope that makes sense. It doesn't really change anything rules-wise. This rule operates the same way as the old rule did. Things don't stack. They don't stack at the moment, and they won't stack in the future. It's just that this is a much neater way of doing it. The other thing that's happening here, this passive ability thing, you'll see later on that there are 2 rules. One of them explains when you create an effect that lasts an amount of time, you are creating a passive ability. So if I cast, I don't know, Mystic Shield or something, and I give a unit +1 to its armor save until the start of my next turn, the rules treat that +1 to the armor save as a passive ability. And that has some implications for ordering of effects and things like that. And the other thing is, there are passive abilities on weapons, like crit. Auto wound is a passive weapon ability. So this rule about being affected by more than one passive at the same time applies to a few different things later on in the rules. And there is a bit of ambiguity about what exactly constitutes the same passive ability. So for example, if I have +1 to my armor save from Mystic Shield and +1 to my armor save from All Out Defense, we assume those stack, and I think they stack, but they are the same ability in a sense. They're both +1 to your save. But I think when it says the same passive ability, it means like exactly the same ability. Not just the same effect, but Mystic Shield can't stack with Mystic Shield, and All Out Defense can't stack with All Out Defense, because they are exactly the same ability. But we're going to see later on why there is some contention and confusion about that, I think particularly when we get to the weapons section. So I'll put that down for now. I think there's some problems with, on initial blush, this stuff seems really straightforward, but there's a few rules that make it not quite clear exactly how this stuff is supposed to work. My bet is this is written wrong, and it's supposed to say you can use 2 of the fight ability, the ability called fight, not just fight keyworded abilities, and they need some clarification about the weapon things. But like I said, we'll get to that later. All right, I'm going to skip past this example. Visibility is really straightforward. I think it's the same as before. There is a small distinction about unit-to-unit visibility and model-to-model visibility, but essentially it's just if any model in a unit is visible to any model in another unit, then the units are visible to each other, even if not every model is visible to every model. But it's just true line of sight, and generally I think the interactions with it make a lot of sense. Combat range. Combat range is a big change. Now we're all at 3 inches rather than using weapon ranges to determine whether or not you can hit someone. You just use the combat range. So it aligns a whole bunch of stuff in the game. Before, there was 3-inch combat range and then like 1-inch weapon range. So you'd often find yourself in combat, but not able to attack. A lot of weird situations came out of that. So I'm kind of happy about this change. There's a few nuances about it, like the combat range extends infinitely in the vertical. So you could plausibly have a guy standing right at the top of a tower and a guy standing right down the bottom of a tower, but horizontally they're within 3 inches of each other, and they're technically in combat with each other, and they could attack each other with melee weapons, despite being 6 or 7 inches away from each other. It'll look a bit funny, but given like the terrain rules and stuff, it's very unlikely to occur because there aren't many bits of terrain that you can actually stand on top of now. I guess the other little idiosyncrasy about combat is that you have to be visible, which I like as an inclusion. They've got this example that shows this Rat Ogre is not in combat with this Liberator because it's actually not visible to the Liberator. So it'll make a difference whether your terrain has holes in it and you can see through them or not. Setting up this stuff I think gets overridden. The GHB or the battle pack or whatever you're using will explain setting up objectives and terrain features and all that sort of stuff. So there's no point in learning that too much. Deployment's really straightforward. They've cleaned up deployment a fair bit. It like has a proper order now. You do faction terrain, and then you use deploy abilities. And again, when it says deploy abilities, it's talking about abilities that say deploy, right? In this case, it's handy because deploy unit, it's not just called deploy, it's called deploy unit. So there's a clearer distinction between the keyword and the ability. But one nuance, most of the time you're putting your army in regiments. So a regiment is like one hero, and I think it's up to 3 non-heroes. There's some other details about regiments, like the general or including heroes in regiments and whatever. But the main thing in terms of deployment is that you have to deploy the whole regiment at once, or you have to deploy it all in separate drops. You can't do half and half. So for example, if you have 4 models in a regiment, or 4 units in a regiment, you can't deploy one of them individually and then deploy the next 3 using deploy regiment. You have to deploy the whole lot as one thing, or you have to use deploy unit on each unit in the regiment. I think that can create a bit of it's sort of a mini game at the start of the game, depending on what drops exactly you have and what drops exactly your opponent has. And if you really understand the way the lists are set up, you might be able to slow drop some of your forces to try and get more information out of your opponent, rather than, if I'm a 2 drop and my opponent's a 30 drop or something, rather than just putting my 2 regiments down one after the other, I can spread my drops out so that, well, if they're stuck on 30 drops, then I can extend my 2 regiments out to like 9 drops or something. So I get to see more of my opponent's deployment as I'm deploying. So there is a little bit of a mini game in that, but otherwise I think deployment's really straightforward and in general a bit clearer about what you're doing. There's a start of battle round, which I quite like. There's also an end of battle round. So these are like sort of little phases in the game. You determine the underdog, an active player, and that sort of stuff. Here, turn phases. I think some people were a bit confused seeing the pre-release stuff about abilities that were color-coded. Like, I know Indrasta had a spear buff that said like her spear does double damage against monsters, and it was coded red. It had this red color, and people thought that meant it only applied in the combat phase, because this diagram was published in one of the pre-release things and sort of indicates that it's a combat phase ability. And it turns out it's just an indicator. It's not rules important at all. It just sort of helps you keep track of what's in what. But I do think it's funny that you have, I'll just show you the ability. You have this color coding to try and make it less confusing what is happening. But instead it ends up making it more confusing, right? So this is the ability here, Prime Huntress, double the damage characteristic of this unit's Thengavar for attacks that target monsters. Thengavar is her spear, and you see it's got a melee profile and a range profile. So a lot of people thought maybe this is just in the combat phase because it's combat phase coded, but it's actually in the shooting phase as well. And instead of making it like half red and half blue to communicate to the player that it works in both phases, they've instead communicated something that's confusing and incorrect, that it only works in the combat phase, and a whole bunch of people got the wrong idea. So bit of an own goal to have something that is meant to make understanding these things more straightforward, and it actually makes them less straightforward. Turns out you just have to pay attention to the actual words in the text. They tell you, like passive, they tell you when it happens. Other abilities will tell you like the phase that it happens in. If it just says passive, it happens all the time. All right. Fight abilities. So I know we talked about that dock thing. This battle trait, and all I can say is this doesn't have a restriction on using more than one fight ability. There are some rules about you have to use fight abilities after you use all your other abilities, and you alternate in using fight abilities. So fight abilities are special in that regard, that you can't just use all your fight abilities one after the other. You have to use fight abilities alternating with your opponent. Same way at the moment you have alternating activations. And I think that might be where the rules writers have gotten confused, because fight is sort of a special keyword. It has additional restrictions about when you can use a fight ability, but none of those restrictions are using more than one in a phase. The restriction is ordering which units use their fight abilities, if that makes sense. So all I'm getting at is that this text doesn't solve the confusion about the rules of one and the Daughters of Cain battle trade here. All right. I think that's all I've got to say for that one. I don't think there's anything too different about these core abilities. Retreat does D3 models to you now. I'm pretty sure everyone has seen that. But otherwise, I'm pretty sure all of these work exactly the same as they used to work. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're all exactly the same, but they use these sort of like keywords to highlight the differences. Movement, I've got something. There's a difference in the movement rules that I care about, but that I don't think anyone else will even notice. So if you watch my previous videos, I talked about the 3rd edition rules actually being a bit weird, and that people don't really use the rules the way they're written. So in 3rd edition, this is the 3rd edition core rules, they talk about tracing a path over the battlefield and then moving the model along the path. So they create this distinction between the path, which you can see here is like rules bolded, and the model itself moving across the battlefield. And they have this little diagram that shows like the path of the model is 5 inches long, and the model moves over the terrain almost like the terrain's not there. There's no exception in 3rd edition that like stops this terrain from being in the way. Like if you move over it, you do have to measure up and down the terrain and add the distance to the movement. So this diagram and this text seems like they're communicating that the path determines the distance the model can move, and the path is different to the space that the model takes up as it moves around the battlefield. No one played it like that anywhere ever, and I think they've ditched it because no one played it that way. Now it works the way people have been playing it. It makes a lot of sense. They just talk about the model moving itself. There's no real talking about the path. I think they mention a path, not rules bolded in the like jump down section. And with their diagram, they show the opposite thing, right? Here they're showing the Praetor cutting through this little barricade, like ignoring that it's there. But here they show this Grey Seer going around the terrain and leaving enough space so that the whole of his base can clear that terrain piece. Like they make it really obvious. The other thing that I like about this diagram is that it shows that you can't, with any part of your base, get into the combat range of other units. This is already the rule in 3rd edition, but a lot of people will do something like they'll move a unit from here to over here that doesn't have fly because they're sort of moving through the combat range. Or maybe they'll trace the path around like this, but the model might be quite big and really they have to do the path like this. It actually adds a lot of movement. Instead of just doing this, they have to go all the way around the combat range. But like I say, that rule hasn't changed. It's just I like the diagram because it more clearly communicates exactly how costly it is to maneuver around a unit's combat range. Coherency is the same, except that they've reduced the distance to 1/2. And there's a problem with, well, not a problem, but there's a lot to talk about when we get down to taking casualties. Because you don't check coherency at the end of the battle shock phase. There is no battle shock phase. You check coherency after casualties. So I'll explain why that's an issue once we get down to it. Moving across terrain, you ignore terrain features that are 1 inch or less in height, and just skipping ahead, the unstable terrain, which is terrain that you can't end a move on, cares about terrain that's 1 inch or taller. So if you've got a piece of unstable terrain, like a forest is unstable, the forest floor that's 1 inch or lower you can end a move on that, but the trees themselves that are 1 inch or taller, you can't end a move on. And I really like this distinction. I like that it creates a sort of rule for when you're designing your terrain features, you know anything 1 inch or lower basically gets ignored. The models don't measure it for distance. It doesn't matter for anything. It's just like decoration and ground cover. Anything 1 inch or taller, or anything taller than an inch, I should say, that stuff is a real part of the terrain feature. It's a bit like the difference between a hitbox and like the actual digital model on a video game. The hitbox is the physics collider that you can actually interact with in the game, and then the other stuff is sort of added on top of it. So I really like that as a distinction. This jumping down thing, I think there's a bit of a vagueness in jumping down. I'll say there's two ways to interpret it. And one way I think you can abuse quite liberally, and that was the interpretation that some people that I talked to had as their like initial interpretation. And there's another way that's much harder to abuse that I think is probably the correct way to do it. So I'm just going to read this rule, and then I'm going to jump over to Tabletop Simulator and show you what I think the difference is. So when a model is on a terrain feature moves, it can jump down from the edge of the terrain feature to land on a lower part of the same or a different terrain feature, or to land on the battlefield. To do so, you must trace the path of the model's move to the edge of the terrain feature. Then that model can jump down any distance, but doing so immediately ends their move. Models cannot end any kind of move mid-jump. If it is not possible to end the move as a result, that move cannot be made. Okay, so the key two sentences are these two here. To do so, you trace a path of the model's move to the edge of the terrain feature. Then the model can jump down any distance, but doing so immediately ends their move. So I'll show you the sort of two interpretations of that. So here we've got a Fulminator, and the Fulminator is going to move, 6 inches? I think he has 10 inches move. We'll say this is a 3-inch tall terrain piece. So he moves to the top of the terrain piece, it goes up 3 inches, and now he has to try and jump down the other side. So one interpretation is just that, well, he traces his path to the edge of the terrain feature. Now he's at the edge, and he just jumps down and ends his movement. But doing so, he sort of gets his whole base worth of movement. Might be a bit clearer if I do it on a bit of terrain that has this sort of flat bit. So this is unstable. Normally you couldn't end a move on top of this terrain feature, but you could start down here, and he might do a run or something. And let's say he moves 3 inches vertically up this wall, and then gets on top of this sort of platform, moves across the platform 6 inches. So he's got 9 inches of movement. He's done 9 inches of movement, I should say. He gets to the edge, that is this edge of the building, and now he's going to do a jump down. So he jumps down like this. And doing so means he moves sort of 9 plus maybe 4 inches. So like 12 or 13 inches somewhere. Quite a long move. His movement's only 10. So he couldn't normally make that move. He's getting extra movement by doing jump down. That's one interpretation. And that's the natural interpretation I think a lot of people will have just reading through jump down. That seems like you trace the movement to the edge, and then you do a jump down. And it says you can jump down any distance. But I think most people will interpret that to mean like you can't jump down, you can't get to the edge here and then jump down any distance like that. You have to jump vertically any distance, but horizontally probably just whatever fits. The other interpretation is that you have to do the whole horizontal movement. So I'll give you an example. This guy is going to move from here to here. That's 8 inches of horizontal movement. The 8 inches there. And he also has to move 3 inches up and 3 inches down. So it's 8 plus 6. It would be 14 inches of total movement, which is obviously too long for the Fulminator. He'd have to add the double or something to do that. And same thing over here. He would have to go sort of 3 inches up the terrain and add in the total 10.5. So it would be 13 or 14 inches movement to get to where he is. So it's much longer, but much harder to abuse. So I'll show you the abuse case. We're going to have a look at a Vlozid, and it's particularly bad with flying because you get free movement, free vertical movement when you fly. So you don't really need jump down, but you can abuse it if we take that first interpretation. So let's say this Vlozid is trying to charge this Fulminator, and I just want to make the gap big enough for him to fit. So if we take that first interpretation, the Vlozid really just has to make it to the wall. So the Vampire Lord and Zombie Dragon, it's going to move 6 inches. He rolls a 6-inch charge. 6 inches doesn't look like it's enough. He's 11 inches away from the Fulminator, but he'll get to 6, which puts him on top of the wall, and then he'll just jump down, and he gains basically his whole base in movement to jump off this wall. So he's made what is an 11-inch charge by rolling a 6. That seems like a lot of additional movement, and I don't think that's the intention of jump down. Whereas I think if you measure, well, it doesn't work with a flying unit, but if you just have to measure the full horizontal distance and you interpret this bit of text where it says the model can jump down any distance to literally mean only downwards, like he can go downwards any distance, then the rule, I think, makes a lot of sense. And if you look at this picture, I think this picture supports that interpretation. So this is sort of, as the model moves across terrain, its base is assumed to stay in contact with the terrain feature and parallel to the battlefield. Models can climb up or down terrain. They can jump down too, but this ends their move. So this is showing him climbing up and down, but presumably you do it the same way. This model would climb up here, climb across here, and as he gets to here, you can notice that like his base is extending out from the terrain and he's sort of holding on with the back of his base. And if we look back on Tabletop Simulator, I'd think you do the same thing here. You would trace the movement up the wall there, then across the top of the terrain here. Then as you get to here, you would have to still trace the path of the movement until the back of his base is sort of, it's hard to show in Tabletop Simulator, it's sort of clipping like this until he's off the terrain, and he would move just with the back of his base touching this wall. He would drop down or jump down exactly down that line. And so you would have to measure the whole movement from front of the base to front of the base. And the only bit you get for free is that vertical movement in the jump down. So that's my interpretation. But I do think this could have been worded possibly a little bit more clearly. Pile-in moves. Pile-ins are a little bit stickier now, and a little bit more liberal. So I did cover this in a previous video. It's a bit different. It's not complicated. It's just different, and you have to pay attention to the differences. You pick a target and pile in all the models in your unit towards that target, even if the target wasn't the closest thing. It's doesn't have to be the closest to any models in the unit at all. So you've got a lot more freedom when you pile in. The only restriction that you have now that you didn't actually have before is that you can't get out of combat with any unit that you started in combat with. So I'll give you a quick demonstration. Like I said, I did cover this in a different video, but we'll just have 2 units here, Protectors and Retributors, and the Vlozid is in combat with both units. He's within 3 of the Protectors and the Retributors. He's going to activate. He doesn't really want to fight both of them at once. So in the old edition, he would just like pile around here. Was 3 inches, something like this. And now he wouldn't be in combat with these Protectors, and he could, eat half of these Protectors and win the fight. But in the current edition, or in the 4th edition, I should say, if he starts in combat, he's got the freedom now to say, well, I'm going to pick these Protectors, and I'm going to pile in towards them and pile 3 inches this way. So he's got the freedom to do this if he wants to. But he also has the restriction that he can't pile away from any unit. So he couldn't pile this way 3 inches and get out of combat with them. He would have to stay so they're just within 3 inches. And when you pair this mentally, when you pair this with the idea that all the combat ranges are 3 inches, piling in like that is not that important, because this Vampire Lord he can already attack with all of his attacks into this protector unit if he wants to. So when you're doing a pile-in move, you just want to figure, where do I want my Vlozard to end up? And keep in mind that you can't like leave combat with any of the units, and then just move the Vlozard to that spot, because chances are he's going to be able to attack whatever he wants, and whatever's in combat, because it has to be within 3 inches, and then it gets a full 3-inch pile-in, their whole unit is going to be able to attack you pretty much wherever you go, no matter what. If they've got a really big unit, that might not be the case, but piling in is a bit different, and once you pair it with the combat rules, it sort of makes sense, and the coherency rules. Fly is back to being really good. You ignore all the vertical distance. 3rd edition was a bit wonky, where you had to measure diagonally through the air. That's not super fun, and a lot of people sort of didn't do it very well anyway. But now you just ignore vertical distance, and it makes flying even stronger and a lot more fun to use. There are some downsides to fly, like you don't get cover, and you can't use obscuring, I think. So you can't use terrain as well, which is, I think, makes sense as a penalty, because the main advantage you get from flying is that you get to ignore terrain being in the way. So the penalty is that you can't use terrain being in the way as a bonus. Obviously, in real life, a unit like a Demon Prince that can fly would just land and hide in the ruins and then would fly out of them later. But I think from a game perspective, it makes sense that the advantage you get is offset by a disadvantage of the same kind. You can ignore some terrain stuff, but it also means you have to ignore beneficial terrain stuff as well. And flying is a really powerful ability, so it's fine to like nerf it in that way, especially since they're buffing it in the ignoring vertical distance. Attacking, I think all this stuff is the same, except that it says, I don't know if you could split attacks before, now you're like free to split however you want. And shooting attacks can't be made in combat unless otherwise specified. You probably already heard that, but that's an important change in the new edition. There's lots of changes that are nerfs to shooting. So we'll see. I reckon over time, shooting units will get buffed as the battle tomes come out, but on release, I think shooting is going to be quite weak. The attack sequence, I think the attack sequence is pretty well the same. There's a clarification about once you finish your attack sequence, it like creates a damage pool, and then the damage pool goes into a damage sequence, which is different to the attack sequence. And that difference matters for, I think, the companion weapon ability. The companion ability says like the weapons with the companion ability aren't affected by things that change the number of attacks or the attack sequence, but I assume they're still affected by things that affect the damage sequence. And the thing that happens to the damage sequence is wards. So if you had an ability like attacks made by this unit, you can't make ward saves for attacks made by this unit. Presumably that would also apply to companion weapons, but something like +1 to hit or +1 attack wouldn't apply to companion weapons. Attack modifiers, we still have the cap, and it still works the same way as before. It's just you're capped at a total of +1 to hit or -1 to hit, and for the save rolls, it's still capped at a total of +1, but it's not capped in the negative. You can reduce someone's save as much as you have rend or whatever it is. Mortal damage, I think, just makes sense. There was a little bit of confusion in some rules in previous editions about if you had a weapon that, for example, did a mortal wound in addition, if you got a 6 to hit, did that count as damage from the weapon, or was that a separate ability causing the damage? And that mattered for like rules like the Magmadroth lava blood that reflected damage back, but only if it was damage caused by a weapon attack, something like that. But this is a little bit clearer. Fast dice rolling, I think, is the same as before, and just sort of makes sense. But it means most of the damage and stuff is meant to happen one by one, which is handy for like rules purposes. It's handy for figuring out how something should work if you get stuck. It's a bit like knowing the fundamentals of math and then knowing a math shortcut. Dice rolling is just fast dice rolling is a sensible shortcut, but everything is sort of done one by one, like before. The damage sequence, I did mention this. just a second ago. So this is where you do wards. They have a flow chart. Yeah, you do like the attack sequence, you hit, wound, and save roll, and all your mortal damage and all of the normal damage goes into this damage pool, and then you sort of do ward rolls for each point of damage in the pool, and you either remove the damage points or allocate the damage points depending on your ward roll. So fairly straightforward, and I like that it's a bit clearer, but fundamentally works pretty well the same way that it used to work. Allocating damage. So there are two things here that I really need to highlight. Allocating damage is done one at a time, and slain models are removed one at a time. There is a small change they made to allocating damage that's really neat, just a quality of life thing, that you allocate damage to a unit instead of to an individual model. That's really handy, but the main point I want to focus on is that you have to do them one at a time. So I'll just read the relevant sections. When allocating damage points to a unit, the damage points in its damage pool are allocated to it one at a time. Each time the number of damage points allocated to the unit equals the health characteristic of that unit, one model in that unit is slain and removed from play. And the number of damage points allocated to that unit is reset to 0. Keep allocating damage points until there are none left in the damage pool. So I'll do an example to show you, but we also have to look at this slain models rule. The commander of a unit must pick which models in the unit are slain. That's the same as it used to be. However, after each model is removed, the unit must be in a single coherent group. That's a new rule. If this is not possible, continue to remove models one at a time until the unit is in a single coherent group. So I'm going to show you a couple examples about what this rule does when you combine it with the coherency rules. So let's say we've got a damage pool of 4 incoming on these Chaos Warriors. So what you do is you start assigning damage points. So we go down one here, up one here. Their health characteristic is 2, so nothing happens. We go down one here, up one here. So out of the damage pool and into the unit, pretty much. Now the health characteristic is 2, and the damage pool is 2. So that's this line here. Each time the number of damage points allocated to the unit equals the health characteristic of that unit, one model is slain, and you reset the pool to 0. So that's what we're doing here. We've got 2, one model is slain, and we reset the pool to 0. Reset this health, or this damage counter, sorry, to 0. And we've still got 2 remaining in the damage pool that we're yet to allocate. The problem that I'm seeing is that this unit was coherent, but after each slain model, remember, after each slain model is removed, the unit must be in a single coherent group. If we check coherency on this unit, they're no longer coherent. This guy, which was in an inch or within half an inch of 2 models, he's now only within half an inch of 1 model. Because there's more than 6 models, this unit's no longer coherent. So what we have to do before we take these wounds is we have to make the unit coherent. We have to keep removing models until the unit is coherent. So we take this guy as a casualty first. Then we start allocating more wounds to him. So reduce 1 here, allocate 1 more wound. Reduce 1 here, allocate 1 more wound. Oh, we take another casualty, check coherency again. Oh no, this guy's not coherent now, so he gets removed as a casualty as well. That's a really unusual example. This was a neat looking unit. It was just 2 lines of 5. That's a standard looking sort of formation. Yeah, they had a little bit of a gap between them, but only the half an inch. What gives? It's because you have to check the coherency between each casualty. And once you get used to anticipating this, I think it makes a lot of sense. You just put your guys in close blocks like this, so that this gap between these 2 models is half an inch. Tabletop Simulator will measure it wrong, but in reality, on the tabletop, this is going to be half an inch. So when you remove this casualty, this guy's still in coherency. Or you'll do something like, just put these guys back. Or you'll do something like staggering them like this, so that they're in a little triangle. So when you remove a casualty, it doesn't break the coherency. But I actually want to show you that the example that I just gave you is kind of not the right way to do it. Because there's one little restriction. So if you put your guys in this sort of formation, again, fairly normal formation, the rules actually say the unit must be in a coherent group, and if it's not possible, then you remove the models one at a time. But there is actually a way to take a casualty from this group. So let's reset this example. You got 4 and nothing yet in the life counter. So we're going to put the 2 wounds on them. So they've got 2. We can actually take one of these models. We can't take him, for example, because that would mean that this guy is not in coherency. But if we take this guy, the unit is still one coherent group. And we're actually required to take this guy. It's not immediately obvious that he's the one we have to take, just looking at the unit. But the rules are written that we have to notice that he is the guy that we need to remove and remove this guy. Then we add the other 2 damage and we have to remove another guy. Now it's not possible. No matter who we remove, we'll be out of coherency. So it really doesn't matter. We just remove a guy and then we notice, hey, we're not in coherency and we have to fix this. So we have to like remove a casualty here and maybe remove a casualty here. And now we've only got 6 models in the unit. So we only have to be within half an inch of another model. And again, it's not measuring it right, but we'll just say that's half an inch. So even though it's the same outcome, you still have 4 dead Chaos Warriors. But you can imagine circumstances where maybe you had a really long line of guys and it ends up, the rules make you pick weird casualties and then your whole unit has a big chain reaction and it happens as soon as you take the casualties. This is a bit, I think, counterintuitive. I think it'll be okay once people start playing with it in mind and they start bunching their units up like this so that the coherency is really tight. But there was a lot of ways in 3rd edition to abuse coherency, which is why they've made these rules. And I think a lot of people won't immediately notice the difference this makes. So I just want to show you what you currently can do in 3rd edition and why this rule change stops it. Because I'm actually a big fan of the change in the rule. The only thing I'm not a fan of is that when my opponent starts removing casualties, I don't want to have to point out to them, oh, actually you have to take that guy first. Or that in between the 2nd and the 3rd casualty there, you broke coherency and you actually had to take another casualty. I don't want to do that. It seems like really pedantic, but the rules are that way to make you position in anticipation of taking casualties. So you kind of have to a little bit. It's just really tedious and like and it's a really awkward interaction that I don't want to have. So I'm just going to show you what you used to be able to do, what it is they're trying to stop by moving the check for coherency. It used to be at the end of the battle shock phase, which just led to abuse. So, for example, this is a 20-man unit of zombies. Look how much space I can make this unit take up. That's like more than half the board. This unit is coherent because each zombie is within 1 inch, at the moment it's 1 inch, of 2 different units. So he's got one buddy there, again it's over measuring it a little bit, but one there and one there. So this guy has 2 guys next to him. On the ends we have to make a little triangle, so 1 inch, 1 inch, 1 inch. So they each have 2 guys within 1 inch of them. So this unit, fully coherent. And what can happen is, say your opponent has, I don't know, some long strikes or something, and maybe a fulminator or 2. There's a couple of fulminators, and they're trying to get into your backline. So they want to shoot this unit of zombies and then maybe charge something back in your backline. As they deal casualties to it, you can take the casualties in like a really weird way so that, let's say we deal 6 casualties to the zombie unit. We can take like these 6 zombies and this screen still survives until the end of the turn. Or we could take, I guess, this one. Still survives. Maybe at the end of the turn, if they don't do any additional damage, we'll take some casualties to coherency. First, we check bravery. Let's say we lost 6 6 zombies. So let's say we roll a 6 on our battle shock. We've got bravery 10, we roll a 6, we're losing 2 additional casualties. Well, we're going to lose these guys to coherency anyway, so we may as well take them as casualties. And now, when we take our coherency check, we actually just lose this one model. So for the low cost of one model out of 20, we were able to take up an enormous amount of space across the board. If you look at the new rules force you to deploy like this. Your 20 zombies take up sort of this amount of space. It's much, much tighter. Even if you space them out, you might be able to take up this sort of distance if you space them all out at half an inch, but you would still be in sort of risk of not being able to reform the unit in a very useful way. And I think in general, you might even want 3 ranks just to make sure that that coherency is really easy to maintain while you're taking casualties. Because if you do the new version of it, and I'll just try and space these guys out again, if we look at what would happen with the new version, we take our 6 casualties. Well, first casualty we take, let's say, is this guy. Then we have to take a whole bunch of coherency casualties. All these guys die. And then we take our second casualty. Well, he'll die. And then, well, we take casualties all the way down to, I think, 6 models. So now we're within 1 inch of 2 models each, 1 model each. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that was 2 casualties. Then we still have 4 more. So we take 4 casualties. And now these 2 fulminators can charge the back line. Right? They can get in through the screen. Also, we don't have battle shock. So I guess that issue is resolved. But the fact that battle shock happened, that coherency was checked after battle shock, meant that you could take a lot of additional casualties that you were expecting to take. You could take them out of what was going to be lost to coherency anyway. So you sort of negated your battle shock if you're doing this trick. So it's a really important change in my view, but it's also something that I think people are going to be a little bit confused by. They might not notice it at first, and it's going to be really awkward and really annoying to try and pull your opponent up on it. So I really hope for this rule that people learn it and they apply it and they really pay attention to it themselves, and it's not too confusing for people, because I think for the health of the game, it is much better to not be able to string your units out into really, really obscenely long screens and to abuse the timing of taking casualties and checking for battle shock to essentially take up a ton of board space without actually doing a whole lot. Or, this is a 120 point unit of zombies, or they might have gone up since maybe 150 point unit of zombies, and it can take up like half the board and just take up a whole turn of shooting and combat. Whereas now it's much easier if people are doing something like that. The unit falls apart much more quickly and at the timing that you need it to happen. So just wanted to talk about that for a little bit. Destroyed units, I think, is fine. The attacking examples make sense. Special rules: strike first and strike last. I still think there's some confusion about strike first and strike last. I face this a little bit, so I wanted to clear something up while I'm here, and then look at the way they've done strike first and strike last, because there's another potential little problem with the way they've worded it. So the main thing I want to focus on initially is, if a unit has strike first and strike last, treat it as if it had neither. There is a weird interaction that happens here that I think screws with people's brains when you have an ability like this that gives you strike last partway through the combat, or and when you also have strikes first. Okay, so let's say that Daughters of Cain, and let's say this ability works properly, so they're just doing fight twice, and the second time they fight they have the strikes last effect. Let's say that you have a way to give your unit strikes first. I think there might even be a Daughters of Cain unit that can get strikes first, one of the snake units. So let's say that you can give that unit strikes first. You can charge with that unit, strike first, so you go before all the normal activations, then you can use this ability and you'll be able to fight again and you'll have strike last. But you still have strikes first. So because you have strikes first and strikes last, now you're in the normal phase and you can activate them again immediately. So essentially they get to fight back to back. They get to fight in strikes first and they get to fight in the normal section. And I think what confuses people here is they think that strikes first and strikes last are related to a single fight activation because of abilities like this. But they're not. They're abilities that the unit has at the time. I might just check if they have this unit in this section. Or it might be... yeah, this thing. If the unmodified charge for a friendly Melusai or Kinerai unit is 8+, that unit has strike first for the rest of the turn. So you charge with your Melusai unit, it gets strike first for the rest of the turn. So not just for its next activation, it has strikes first for the rest of the turn. So it'll fight in the strikes first phase of combat, then you'll trigger all out slaughter and it'll be able to fight again. And next time when it fights, well, once you trigger all out slaughter, it gets strikes last, but it still has strikes first. It doesn't lose strikes first just because it activated and fought first. So it'll have both of them, it'll cancel out, and you'll get to fight one after the other. And that's why this is actually a bit of a combo. It seems like a non-bow because you're like, I already have, I've got a thing that makes me strike last, and this thing's going to make me strike first. That's a bit annoying, but actually they stack together. You can use strike first with thing that gives you strike last, especially because it's a thing that lets you fight twice. It's actually a fairly neat combination, but I've seen even TOs rule the other way on it. The rules are very, very clear about how it works. It's just not something they put in the FAQs, almost because you don't really need an FAQ. There is a problem with the way these are worded, not to do with that combo of abilities. The way they're worded now, they're trying to avoid making like sub-combat phases. And so they've done it like by just reordering all the combat to make sure it all happens in the right order. And I think that's a really neat solution, but there's like a loophole that I can see that might cause a problem. So let's just read these two abilities. If there are any strikes first units in combat, at the start of the phase, other units cannot be picked to use a fight ability until those units have been picked to use a fight ability. So units that don't have strike first can't be picked until the units that do have strike first have been picked to use a fight ability. After all those strikes first units have fought, the active player picks the next unit to fight. This is sort of how it works at the moment. Then you've got, if there are any strike last units in combat, they cannot be picked to use a fight ability if there are any units in combat that do not have strike last that have not yet used a fight ability. So both of these have the same problem. And I just want to highlight, I'll show, actually I think Be'lakor might have I'm not sure exactly that Be'lakor breaks this, but he might do so. Okay, so the Dark Master, pick an enemy unit to be the target until the start of your next turn. Each time that target is picked to use an ability, roll a dice as a reaction. On a 3+, that ability has no effect. Okay, so let's say you've got a strike last unit. The strike last rule says you can't pick your strike last unit to fight until all of the units that are in combat that don't have strike last have used a fight ability. Okay. So let's say, I might even give you an example. So just to make it clear, we've got some Chaos Knights and a Demon Prince, and we actually just need two here. So we'll say that the Demon Prince has strikes last for whatever reason. There's a spell that's been cast on him or something, and he's got strikes last. The problem is, these zombies have been affected by Be'lakor's Dark Master ability, and now, when they tried to fight, they rolled a dice, they didn't roll the 3 up, Be'lakor did roll the 3 up, however it works. They weren't allowed to fight. They were picked to fight, but the fight ability had no effect. This unit hasn't fought yet, which means the strike last unit can't fight yet, right? Because any units in combat that do not have strike last and have not used a fight ability yet. So I guess there is a slight interpretation. The Be'lakor probably doesn't break it because they use the fight ability, but it doesn't have any effect. But there's still a bit of a danger zone here if they make an ability that stops someone using a fight ability. If for whatever reason you can't use the fight ability, that inherently breaks the strike last and strike first effects because they're all ordered around every single unit using a fight ability. So Be'lakor probably doesn't break it, but it's an effect like Be'lakor's where that fight ability, instead of just not doing anything, you end up not being able to use the ability at all. So that's the only thing I wanted to highlight there. It's not necessarily an issue, but it's like a time bomb for some battle tome at some point might write this rule and sort of break all of combat. I think you can, as a TO, you can rule around that really straightforwardly and figure it out pretty easily. But it's just interesting that they've created this sort of, I'm going to call it a vulnerability that will eventually sort of show up at some point. All right. How are we doing on time? Bloody huge. Okay. So let's have a look at weapon abilities. Weapon abilities, like I mentioned earlier, with the rules of one, weapon abilities are passive abilities, and you can't have more than one of the same passive ability. And these abilities have like the same name. So we'll just refresher on it, just to make sure we're doing it right. So a unit cannot be affected by the same passive ability more than once at the same time. For example, if they've got cover, whatever. We don't need the example. So you can't be affected by the same passive ability. And remember I said that the same thing is going to be a little bit confusing when we get here. So I think maybe I should have a look at a unit that has one of these abilities. I think Lumineth has one. They got their spear guys, and the spear guys get like fights first or something. Wall of Blades. Effect. If this unit did not charge this turn and is in combat with an enemy unit that charged, roll a dice, add one to the roll. If that unit is cavalry, on a 4+, this unit has strikes first for the rest of the turn. No, that doesn't help us. The other one to check, I guess, is the Stormcast one. Their spear guys might have the right ability to help us understand what's going on here. That's not in this article. It's going to be in one of these articles. I know there's one in combat mechanics, the orc thing. That's fine. That's not what we need. Vindictors. Then they get strike first. Okay, neither of these exactly have the thing that we want. That's right. We're just going to have to use our imagination. So, some weapons have one or more of the passive weapon abilities below. If a weapon has multiple weapon abilities that apply on a critical hit, before the attack sequence starts, the commander of the attacking model must pick one of those abilities to use. So straight off the bat, we know some of these don't stack. So crit 2 hits, crit auto wound, crit mortal, and even multiple instances of crit 2 hits or crit auto wound, those things won't stack. You have to pick one of them. No matter how many of them you end up having, you have to pick one of them, and that's the one that you use. But for some of the other ones, like charge +1 damage, plausibly, you could have 3 or 4 instances of charge +1 damage. And we have to know whether or not that can stack. And when I watched Vince Venturella's coverage, they had a really weird interpretation about how these things do and don't stack. Mostly to do with anti-X rend. So I'm going to read the anti-X rend thing, and then we'll go to the example. So add 1 to this weapon's rend characteristic if the target has the keyword after anti or fulfills the condition after anti. Multiples of this ability are cumulative. All right, so clearly says that they're cumulative. In some way, they're cumulative. For example, if a weapon has both anti-charge +1 rend and anti-hero +1 rend, then add 2 to the rend characteristic of the weapon's attacks that target a hero that charged in the same turn. Okay, so if they're two different kinds, we know they stack. That's the example they've given us. But what if they're two of the same kind? What if you have anti-charge +1 rend twice? So maybe the unit has it innately in their war scroll, and you also cast a spell on them that gives them anti-charge +1 rend. So they have two instances of anti-charge +1 rend. To my mind, it says multiples of this ability are cumulative, so you can stack them, right? But I think what's happening with people like Vince is that they're looking at that rule of ones earlier, and the rule of one says you can't have multiples of the same passive ability. But my interpretation of that is that there would be two different passive abilities. So any of these guys, like this passive ability, anti-charge +1 rend, is a passive weapon ability, but it's the passive weapon ability on their spear. And if you cast a spell that gave them anti-charge +1 rend, that would be the passive ability from the spell. So they would be different passive abilities. The same way you could stack something like All Out Defense with a spell that gives you +1 to your save. And we know that you can stack this sort of thing because they have rules about how to handle multiple instances of +1 to your save or +1 to hit. Right? You can stack +1 to hit with +1 to hit. We know you can do that. I mean, it still caps them to the total +1, but the abilities aren't treated as the same passive ability in terms of the rule of one. So in my mind, these things should be able to stack. If you can give a unit multiple instances of the same anti-X +1 rend ability, then it should have multiple instances of that and it should stack. You'll have -2 rend against people who charge or -2 rend against heroes. And it doesn't only stack when you have different versions of them. So the next question is, does charge +1 damage stack? So it doesn't say multiples of this ability are cumulative. But is there anything that actually stops this from stacking? If you have on your war scroll an ability that, like, your weapon says charge +1 damage, but then you also have a spell or some other effect that says give this unit charge +1 damage, would you get +2 damage on the charge? Like, this doesn't say that it's cumulative or that it stacks with itself. But if we look at that rule of one, we have to interpret it either that giving something charge +1 damage, that is the same ability. Anything that gives you charge +1 damage is the same passive ability, or we have to interpret it like the source of the ability makes it a different ability. And if you interpret it the first way, if you interpret it like any rule that gives you charge +1 damage is the same ability and they don't stack, or the same passive ability, then you also have to interpret like +1 to your armor save or +1 to your attacks as the same ability and it doesn't stack. And that breaks so many other things. It just makes the whole rules not work. So the question I'm eventually getting to is, why does this even say multiples of this ability are cumulative? There's nothing in the game that says they're not cumulative aside from that rule of one. So to me, I'm really confused. I don't know exactly how to work these things out because either interpretation has some really weird game-breaking outcomes at the other end. I think maybe they're interpreting in a really narrow, weird way, like universal weapon abilities. There's like an ability that gives you an ability. So, wait on. Do they have, I think it's in the GHB thing. Do they have a, Subtract 1 for the attacks characteristic. There's a General's Handbook rule that... No, that's Spearhead. You can give a unit like anti-X Rend just through the General's Handbook. I don't think I have that on hand, but you can give it to any unit in your General's Regiment. So it would be very easy to stack anti-X Rend. You can do it anywhere. So this question is going to come up straight away. And I think maybe the interpretation is this ability is an ability, and when you have something that gives you anti-X Rend, that's an ability that has the effect of giving you an ability. And I'm just trying to find an example that I can sort of point out where that's happening. I don't think I'm going to be able to do it on the fly because nothing's organized. But plausibly, if I have like All Out Defense, that gives me +1 to my save, and Mystic Shield also gives me +1 to my save. +1 to my save characteristic isn't an ability. It's just an improvement to my characteristics or whatever. But if I have an ability, like a spell that gives me charge +1 damage, then that spell has the passive effect of giving me another ability. And because I have 2 of the same ability, they won't stack. So there's like a little way out of it, but it is a very confusing interpretation. And it's not at all the straightforward, obvious interpretation of the rules. That's what I'm getting at. I think it might be the intention, but I think playing the game of intentions it's a bit like an anchoring bias thing. You want to have good rules-based arguments for why you understand the rules the way you understand them. You don't want to be relying on interpretation, because most of the time the interpretation is like just the first understanding that you had, and you think, oh, that's the obvious intuitive one, but you'll come across people that have different ones, and you have to be able to like back up your version, the thing that you believe, by reference to the rules in a really straightforward way. And the problem I'm having with this set of rules, with whether or not these things stack, is I can interpret them both ways, and both would be fine, except both interpretations cause other really, really weird circumstances to happen. So I'd love to know, again, if you're watching at this point, I'd love to know what you think happens here and why you think it happens that way. Again, just try and reference the rules when you do so, not just the sort of intention, because I'm not even certain what the intention is in some of these. I assume anti-X Rend is supposed to stack, at least if you have different types of it, and then charge +1 damage won't stack, and these ones, they all don't stack because it specifically says they don't stack. So like, I think this is just to save space. This is another way of saying it. None of these things are supposed to stack, but instead of writing anti-charge Rend, anti-hero Rend, like literally listing every possible type of anti-something Rend, they just have it as anti-X Rend, and then they say it stacks. I think that's what's happening here, but that's just my guess. It could be, I've had a guess like that where I'm like 100% certain before, and then Games Workshop has surprised me. So anyway, moving on. Returning and adding models. Oh, there's a tiny, tiny little difference to adding models. I'm not even sure everyone had this problem before. It might have just been Soulblight Gravelords. But let's say we're down to 1 zombie in our unit, and we've got all these slain zombies. In the current rules, when you add models, you have to add them in coherency with the model that's there. So you can put them up to, so they're 1 inch away from the model that's already there. But if I was returning, I don't know, 10 zombies to this unit somehow, I wouldn't be able to put one here because this one is more than 1 inch away from the one that I started with. The new rules are a bit different. They're just like taking casualties but in reverse. So you just put them in order, and you can just place them, as long as they're in coherency, you can just place as many as you want, and you can string them out. And so there's a bit of a difference in terms of if you are using, let's say you're using like Deathly Invocation and Rally and all that sort of stuff to get a whole bunch of models back. In the past, the maximum amount of difference, let's say we want this zombie unit to charge the Demon Prince, the maximum amount of distance we'd be able to get towards this Demon Prince is like this. You can get like 2 inches, and that's it. because any other unit that's further away would be out of range of the model that was alive at the start of the phase, or when you started returning models or something like that. But with the new change, the way this is worded, it just says set those models up one at a time in coherency with the models in the unit that were not returned or added. Oh no, I'm fucking wrong. I don't know why I'm telling you this. It says not returned or added this turn. Okay, don't worry. Ignore me. It's the same. I thought it was different. I don't know why I read that like 4 times, and it's not different. It's exactly the same. So you can't actually get any further out than that. And I guess because coherency is shorter now, well, I guess we've got an opposite lesson. All right. So if you're returning models and we're returning like 10 zombies, you'll have to return them like this because they have to be in coherency, right? They have to be in coherency with the models in that unit that were not returned or added this turn. Now that I read that again, I'm actually not even certain that makes sense. Because how do you be in coherency? Like, I'm adding this model. I've got 6 models left. I need to be within, I guess when they say incoherency, they literally just mean within half an inch. Because coherency range is half an inch. They don't mean like, this guy has to be within half an inch of 2 units. And it says 2 units that were not returned or added this turn. Well, I only have 1 model that wasn't returned or added this turn. So I literally can't be returned in coherency with that. But maybe it just means like I have to be within half an inch. So I can't actually return 10 models to this zombie unit. I can only return these 1, 2, 3, 6 models to the unit, and I can only get 1 inch closer to the Demon Prince. Okay. I was going to give an opposite lesson. I thought they made this nicer, but actually they've made it more restrictive than I previously thought. That's something to watch out for, especially if you play Soulblight Gravelords, and if they keep the good skeleton rule. Skeletons could return, sometimes they'd return 20 models or 10 or 15 models in a single ability, and if you were that low in the number of skeletons that you had, like you had a 30-man unit that had been reduced to 2 or 3 skeletons, often you didn't actually have enough room to put all the new skeletons back, and that's going to be even harder to do. I should have reread this before commenting on it, but there you go. Tokens are like, you just ignore them. They're just decoration. And I think this is really nice. It was always a bit weird having a hero that had like 2 models in the unit. So literally a lot of the little sidekicks that people have, they're just going to be for actual decoration, and you ignore them for everything. Setting up units. You can't use move abilities in the same turn that you set up. They've just hard-coded that as a core rule. I really like that as a core rule. Pretty much all the time where they have a rule that is the same way on every single different war scroll. Every time they do it, they may as well just move that duplicated rule section into the core rules. So that makes sense here. Reserve units, I think, just makes sense. Replacement units. I don't know how many people are used to this. Because I play Soulblight, I'm used to this. And I'm pretty sure it's exactly the same as before. They might have changed the rounding on it. Half in the cases you pick. Oh, there is a little nuance. If you're returning a half strength unit, it seems to imply that you get to pick which models from the full strength unit you get to put in the half strength unit. So if you had 2 champions and 2 standard bearers and 2 musicians in your reinforced unit, when you bring back the half strength unit, it seems like you can pick a unit that is 2 champions, 2 musicians, 2 standard bearers, and then like 4 other guys. But then it's treated as a wholly original unit. That's a weird outcome to me, that you can do that. But like, it seems pretty clear that you can. So it has the same war scroll type, same weapon options, and number of models as the original unit, unless otherwise specified in the ability. Many of these abilities specify the proportion of models in the replacement unit, e.g. half the models from the original unit. In these cases, you can pick which models from the original unit are set up, which I guess is kind of neat. I guess another thing to note here is that if you've got like a once per battle ability, the replacement unit is a new unit, so it doesn't count as having used any of its once per battle abilities, that just sort of makes sense, but it's worth pointing out. Guarded Heroes. Guarded Heroes is, I think, a little bit clearer because they don't reference wounds anymore. It's all just done with keywords. So before, it used to be like if you were 10 or more wounds, then you couldn't get Guarded Heroes. And then if you had a mount, then you didn't get this little section, but you did get this section, which I think confused people just because it's like it cares about wounds for half of the ability, and then it cares about whether or not you have a mount for the other half. And now it's all just keywords, so it's, I think, easier to keep track of mentally. So if you're not a monster or a war machine, then you'll get Guarded Hero. So you get -1 to be hit if you're near a non-hero. This requirement changed a little bit as well. It used to have to be within like a unit that has 3 or more models or something. Now it's just a non-hero. So again, nice, simple, clean, just keyword focused stuff. So if you're a hero and you're standing near a non-hero, you don't happen to be a monster or a war machine, then you'll get -1 to hit against you. And if you happen to be infantry as well, then you can't be picked as the target of shooting attacks made by units more than 12 away from you. The biggest thing I'm excited about here is the Demon Prince. The Demon Prince is infantry. He's not a monster. He's not a war machine. So he gets -1 to be hit, and you can't shoot him if you're more than 12 away from him. And he just has like decent abilities and is worth taking now. Worth checking some of your loser heroes to see if they're any good now, but most of them will be like a guy and a horse, and so they don't get the best version of Guarded Hero, but a lot of the time a guy and a horse, especially with just shooting nerfs, the amount of wounds they have, being -1 to hit, all that sort of stuff, that's good enough protection a lot of the time. Random characteristics. I think random characteristics make sense. I haven't thought about it too much. There might be a problem with it. Modifier order. This is fairly sensible by itself, but we're going to see in a second that there are some confusing... There's like 3 abilities that tell you how to order things. And it's a bit like having 3 tiebreakers without an explanation of which tiebreaker you use first. You need to have an order in which the tiebreakers are applied, because if you don't, you can't apply them all at the same time. It's just not possible to do that. All of them tell you the order, and they tell you different orders. So this one makes sense for characteristics. You set the characteristic first, then you do multiply or divide, then you do add or subtract. It's like BODMAS stuff. It's a really, really sensible, straightforward thing. But we'll start to see, once we get down to contradictory and order of effects, that those 3 rules are sort of all doing the same thing, and they all contradict each other. All right. Advanced ability rules. I think all of these make sense. So unless stated otherwise, units using or picked as part of an ability must be on the battlefield. I think most people assumed they were, but it's nice to include a rule that says that. If an effect states that a unit can do something, its commander can choose whether or not to resolve that part of the effect or not. So can gives you an option, which is, it's good that it explains that. But again, most people would have interpreted that fine. If an effect states that a unit must do something, then the commander has no choice and must resolve that part of the effect. I think it's funny that it's basically tautological. Like if it says you must do something, then you must do it. Okay, cool, but at least we're nice and clear. It's a bit like the thing Miniac was upset about, like a wizard is a wizard. Yes, good, thank you. I like that it's nice and clear. If this is impossible, no part of the effect is applied, but the ability is still considered to have been used. Okay, so this actually does... Remember how I said earlier with if Be'lakor stops you from fighting, does that screw up the strikes first, strikes last? Well, according to this rule, it says the ability is still considered to have been used, so the unit still used a fight ability, so it wouldn't ruin the strikes first thing, but you can imagine somebody has written a rule that just prevents you from even trying to use the fight ability. That would screw up a lot of the rest of what's happening. So actually, I guess maybe they just know not to write those sorts of rules. When this unit appears in ability text, most often War Scrolls, it means the unit that is using the ability. This is actually really important. There's an explanation over here. I might come back to this just after I've done the advanced ability rules. If an ability affects more than one unit, the player who uses the ability can choose the order in which units are affected by it. When resolving the effect, if you need to roll dice for multiple affected units, roll and resolve the effect for one unit before moving on to the next. I do like that it spells this out. It almost never matters, but it just says, again, it's just a little ordering thing that like, if you do D3 models to up to 3 target units, you do one, you do their D3 models and resolve them all, and then you do the next one and then resolve them all, and the next one and resolve them all, just so that you have like an official, accurate way if it ends up mattering for something. Most of the time it won't matter, and you can do it out of order, but in case it does, you know how it's supposed to work. If an ability instructs you to pick more than one unit, each unit you pick must be different, must be a different unit unless stated otherwise. So this used to be different, I think, in 3rd edition. I like it better this way. It makes sense to me. If you have to pick 3 units, they have to be 3 different units, and most abilities make more sense like that. And then in the instances where they want you to pick the same unit more than once, or they want to give you that ability, it makes more sense that they do that intentionally, I think. So these are all good. Let's briefly talk about who is using the ability. I'm actually going to skip over persisting effects just for a second and look at once per timings in conjunction with this. These 2 things are very important. So the once per timings, the timing of some ability says once per phase, once per unit, or once per battle. If the ability is used by a unit, it can be used a maximum of 1 time in that phase, turn, or battle by each unit that can use the ability. If the ability is used by a player, it can be used a maximum of 1 time in that timing window by that player. So there's a distinction between the unit using an ability and the player using an ability. And the way we know which unit is using the ability is by reading this box. The main thing is, actually, I'll go through the box. Most abilities have found on War Scrolls, but many appear elsewhere, the best examples being universal core abilities. While abilities on War Scrolls are always used by the unit whose War Scroll it is, some abilities do not appear on War Scrolls. That do not appear on War Scrolls will tell you explicitly to pick a unit to use the ability. In both cases, it should be clear which unit is using the ability. Some abilities do not appear on War Scrolls, like enhancements. Enhancements are used by the unit that is given the enhancement. Abilities that neither appear on a War Scroll nor tell you to pick a unit to use the ability are used by you, the player. Finally, for the purposes of rules in this section, when a rule refers to a player using an ability, this includes abilities used by units in that player's army. Okay, I'm going to ignore that last one. I think that's it's just saying the rules apply to abilities. We don't really need that. The bits we need are that if the ability doesn't tell you to pick a unit to use it, and it's not on a War Scroll, then you're using it. But if it tells you to pick a unit, then the unit's using it. So I'll give you, I know 2 examples. The dock ability is one of them. So, well, actually, yeah, the Slaves to Darkness have another one. Okay, so this ability says, declare, pick a friendly Daughters of Cain infantry unit that is in combat to use this ability. So in this case, the unit is the thing using the ability. The player is not using the ability. The unit is using the ability. And so what it says is once per battle, any combat phase. So that means every single one of your units in your entire army can use this ability, but each unit can only use it once per battle. That's what the sum of those rules together means. Initially, when you read this, you might think once per battle any combat phase means I, the player, can only use it once because it's like a battle trait, and I have to use it in a combat phase. But you don't use the ability. The Daughters of Cain infantry unit that you picked that is in combat, that unit can use the ability. So every single one of your units in your army can use all-out slaughter. It's a command, and I'm pretty sure commands are limited to, you can only use each command once per phase. So you couldn't use all-out slaughter on every single different unit in the same phase. And if we look back up again at the once per timings, we have rules of 1. A unit cannot use the same ability more than once per phase unless specified otherwise. But different units can use the same ability, which makes sense. So if this wasn't a command, plausibly the entire Daughters of Cain army could all use their once per battle ability to fight twice in the same phase, which is an interesting difference to how I initially interpreted the rule, reading it just in the faction focus. This timing, I think, is very confusing, especially when you have other abilities that are like once per turn army. They have like this, they have the army restriction. So I'll just find the rest of that rule explains that. So some abilities that are used by units say once per phase army, or once per turn army, or once per battle army. These abilities can be used a maximum of one time in that phase, turn, or battle, regardless of the number of units in the army that can use the ability. So, for example, all of the Stormcast Ruination Chamber guys all have an ability that's like once per phase army. They can like roll a dice, and on a 3-up, they ignore an ability that they're being affected by. If you have 4 or 5 of them, only one of them can use that ability across the whole army. So this army thing points upwards, right? It sort of says, even though this unit is using the ability, it also prevents anyone else in the unit using the ability. That sounds the same. Like if we had once per turn army, that sounds the same as giving the player an ability that is once per turn. Because there's only one player, so you can only use that once per turn. So I'll show you an example of that. This is the Eye of the Gods. Here you declare it. Each friendly Slaves to Darkness unit that destroyed an enemy unit this turn is a target. So this is an ability that the player uses, and they target their units with it. The units aren't using the ability. The player is using the ability on their units. So it's once per turn, end of any turn. You can only use it that one time in that turn. Thankfully, it lets you target any number of units. But there's a distinction between, even though these look the same, like once per battle, once per turn, they look like they have the same kind of restriction. This one you can actually use quite a lot because the unit is the thing using it. This one you can only use once because the player is using it. I think that's pretty confusing. They certainly could have cleared that up. But once you wrap your head around it, it starts to make a bit more sense. All right. Persisting effects. I'm going to talk about, I think this is related to contradictory rules and order effects and modifier order and all that sort of stuff. Wonder how far through we are. No, all right. I think I'll keep going. This is a rat's nest. This set of rules is, I'm not sure it even works or makes sense. There is an interpretation I think that you could get that makes sense, and it's probably what they're intending, but just reading them, they don't work. So some abilities have effects that aren't immediately resolved, and I'm not sure this is part of them. It might just be these things. Anyway, persisting effects. Some abilities have effects that aren't immediately resolved, e.g. add 1 to save rolls for this unit for the rest of the turn, or this unit has ward 5+ for the rest of the turn. These effects count as effects of passive abilities for their duration. So I wonder if it fixes some of the earlier problems that they're not passive abilities in and of themselves, but they are effects of passive abilities. So if you have All Out Defense is a passive ability, and the effect of All Out Defense is that you get +1 to your save. And then like these are abilities, and the effect of charge +1 damage is this effect here. And so you can't stack the ability, and charge +1 damage is an ability. This charge +1 damage is exactly the same as like All Out Defense. All Out Defense is an ability, charge +1 damage is an ability, and this is the effect of it. And so you can't stack abilities, but you can stack the effects. I still don't know what this means, because then you can't stack. I think this is how Vince got to his conclusion. You can't stack like anti-charge +1 rend, but you can accumulate anti-charge +1 rend and anti-hero +1 rend, because these are two different abilities, but they have the same effect, and they're just saying that the effects are cumulative. I don't know. I find that pretty confusing. But anyway, that's not relevant for these things. It might solve some of those issues with the weapon stuff. So persisting effects. Some abilities. Oh, we already read it. I'm gonna break out Paint. I'm gonna show you a diagram, and you're gonna think, why are you showing me this diagram? Why are you drawing this? So we're gonna draw. It's just a line, right? Just a horizontal line, and we're gonna call this. This line is time, and we want the past and the present. Okay. All of the language they use in this article talks about making things more recent. So the most recent thing is here, and the least recent thing is back here. Or, well, least recent thing would be there. So more recent goes towards the present, less recent goes towards the past. That makes a lot of sense, but as you start to read these rules, it will break down in your mind. So let's say at this point in time, we give ourselves a 5+ ward. 5+ ward. Then later on, we give ourselves a... Oh, wait, it's the other way around. Sorry. Back here, we're going to deal D3 mortals. D3 mortals. And then up here, we're going to give ourselves a 5+ ward. So 5+ ward. Obviously, you got the ward after you took the mortal damage. So you don't get to make ward saves against the mortal damage because the ward save happened after the mortal damage. Okay? Just want to keep that in mind. If you have multiple abilities that set something, so say for example you have an ability back here that sets your movement to 6, and then you have an ability up here that sets your movement to 4, then you would expect that this one happens, this one's the one you've got because it happened afterwards. It's more recent. It happened afterwards, so it's more recent. So it takes precedence. Okay, I just wanted to highlight some of that before we get into this. It'll make more sense as we read more. So contradictory rules. If 2 or more rules contradict, if one of those rules states that something cannot do something, this takes precedence over rules that say it can or must do something, unless the second rule specifically overrides the restriction of the first. This is a very confusing sentence, but this does make sense. Basically, like, abilities in general in the game say you can do things. So like move as an ability lets you move things. And if you have an ability that says, well, you can't move, then can't has to beat can. Otherwise, all of the can't abilities wouldn't function, right? Because you would just say, well, this ability says I can move. This ability says I can't move. I'm just going to move because this one says I can do it, right? This, unless the second rule specifically overrides the restriction of the first, is because sometimes the ability that you're getting is removing a restriction that you already have. So for example, while the normal move ability states you cannot move into combat during that move, the fly ability specifies to ignore the combat ranges of any models during the move. So pretty much the situations where can beats can't are situations where you've got a rule that is removing a restriction that you would otherwise have. So far, I think that makes a fair bit of sense. That bit is actually fairly straightforward. I think it's how the Magic the Gathering works as well, but it doesn't solve every situation. So accepting the above, if this doesn't figure it out, then the effect of the most recently used ability takes precedence. Okay, remember this chart? The most recently used ability takes precedence. That's, just keep that in mind, right? We already have a problem because if we have the most recently used ability take precedence and that conflicts with this modifier order, we've already got 2 ways of sorting out which thing happens first, right? Or which thing happens in what order. I'm not sure how many abilities would actually work this way, but something like setting the movement characteristic doesn't seem to ruin the game, even though you have two ways of setting them, right? Like you know that you set before you add or subtract or multiply or divide. So if you have two abilities that set this, like if you set the movement to 6 and then you set the movement to 4, this ability down here, this contradictory rules ability, lets you know when in time, like the timestamp one, which one to pay attention to. And you pay attention to the most recent one. All right? I know I'm laboring that point, and so far this seems straightforward, but it'll get very confusing very quickly. So, accepting the above, the effect of the most recently used ability takes precedence. Beautiful. But there are situations where you'll have rules that both rely on each other, but are not contradictory rules. So, for example, if I have an ability that says, for every attack, give my weapon +1 damage, and then I have a different effect that says, for every point of damage my weapon has, give it +1 attack. I need to know what order to resolve those in, because it'll matter doing the math. One will give me a bigger result than the other. One will give me more damage, one will give me more attacks. So I need to know the order. They're not contradictory, they're sort of complementary abilities. So I need a way of figuring them out. So we have this order of effects thing. I'm going to ignore this first sentence just for a second. The effects of the active player's passive abilities are considered to be applied more recently than the effects of their opponent's passive abilities. Whose passive abilities are considered to be applied more recently than the effect of neutral abilities? The active player chooses the order in which neutral passive effects are applied. So I know why they're doing this. They're doing this because passive effects are hard to timestamp. If you have, like, let's say I have a hero that gives units near it +1 attack, or sorry, I have a hero that makes the movement of units near it into a 4, and my opponent has a hero that changes the movement characteristic of units near it into a 2, then it's hard to tell when a unit started being affected by those abilities, or even if that's the right place to timestamp it. Like in my movement phase, maybe I moved the unit away and then I moved the hero to catch up. So they were briefly outside the range of the aura and then they were back inside the range. Does that update the timestamp, or do we go from a different timestamp? Maybe we use when the passive started being on the battlefield. So like when I deployed the hero that had that passive, and then we have to keep track of who deployed what in what order and go back in time to the start of the game. And we might have forgotten this information to figure out what order the timestamps happened in. And it gets a bit confusing with passive effects. So the point of this order of effects rule is to order those passive effects so that you can figure out which ones happen first and which ones happen second. Most of the time it doesn't matter. But like I said, if you have an ability that's like you get +1 attack for each point of damage you have, and then you have another passive effect that says you get +1 damage for each attack you have, then this will tell you the order to put those things in. I'm pretty sure, it doesn't actually say it here, but I'm pretty sure the player gets to order their own passive abilities and the opponent gets to order their own passive abilities if they've got multiples of them. But the problem is when you have passive effects that also do this sort of stuff. Okay? So in this case, we might have a modifier that adds to their movement. So let's say I'm the active player and I've got a bonus that gives +2 to the movement. And you're the inactive player and you have a bonus that multiplies the movement, or I guess halves the movement. Let's say that. So I'm adding 2 and you're halving it. Well, according to this, we do the divide first and then we do the add or subtract. So you divide it in half, then we add our movement, add our +2. But according to order of effects, we do it the other way around. I'm the active player, so I add 2 to the movement, and then you divide it by 2. That's pretty confusing already. There's 2 different ways to resolve the same ordering problem. And here it says, if there are multiple modifiers of the same type, e.g. that set characteristics, apply them in order of effects. I'll get to this. So it says to use order of effects if there's multiple things that apply at the same time. So for example, if I've got that, wait, did I leave that up? If I've got the ability that sets a unit's move characteristic to 6, and then you've got an effect that sets it to 2, let's say like I cast the spell, sets it to 6, and then you use Unleash spell, what's it called? Magical Intervention to cast your spell. You will cast the spell second, but because it's my turn, my ability takes precedence. So I just want to highlight what is happening on the timeline. So I cast my spell and set the movement of my guy, I'm going to say to 6. And then later in the turn, you use Magical Intervention to cast a spell on the same unit and set it to 4. However, we don't need that. We don't need that. We're jumping around all over the place. This rule tells us if there are multiple modifiers of the same type, so we're modifying the movement characteristic, we're setting the characteristic, then apply them in order of effect. So instead of using the order in which they're applied, which is what I thought we'd be doing, especially when we looked at contradictory rules, because setting it to 12 and setting it to 4 seems to be a contradictory rule. It can't be both 12 and 4, that's contradictory. So we would use the timestamp. The most recent one takes precedence, meaning the 4 would take precedence. But now we're learning it's actually AppNap. It's active player, non-active player. So order of operations, sorry, not order of operations, order of effects says the effects of the active players are considered to be applied more recently. So what we do is we move this ability up here. So I cast a spell that sets my movement to 6. You use Magical Intervention to set the movement to 4. My movement is still 6. This is really confusing to me. I don't know why this is the case. It's not just that it's unintuitive. It's also that you have two different rules that tell you how to do it. Contradictory rules still seems to apply. Modifier order applies, and contradictory rules applies, and order of effects applies. All of them tell you how to order the abilities. And there's a feedback loop. There's a feedback loop between order of effects and contradictory rules. Initially, you read this and it makes sense. You're like, the most recent ability takes precedence. But now, order of effects tells you to rearrange which ability is the most recent ability. That's, I think, fairly sensible when it comes to passive abilities. But when it comes to the effects of passive abilities and other abilities, my mind breaks. I have no clue what the heck this is talking about. So let's just read this bit. I don't even know how to apply this rule. I don't even think you need to. The effects of passive abilities are considered to be applied more recently than the effects of other abilities and rules. So again, we're looking at this chart and we're back to that example where we deal D3 mortals. That's the effect of an ability. And then we have a passive ability like 5+ ward. Okay. So the passive ability was applied later in time, more recently than the D3 mortals. Common sense tells you, you take the D3 mortals, you don't get a ward save, then you've put the 5+ ward, then you'll get a ward save on any damage, any abilities that deal damage later on. But if we read this, it seems to say the effects of passive abilities are considered to be applied more recently than the effects of other abilities and rules. More recently. So like, even if you put the ward on first, so you put it back here, you have a 5+ ward, it's telling you that the effect of this ward is considered to be applied more recently than the D3 mortals. I guess. Like, this is the effect of an ability that's not a passive. But then it means it takes precedence. I don't know what it means to take precedence in this case. Does it mean that you get the ward? Even though you've moved it to after the time that it happened? This, honestly, it breaks my brain. I think I'm overthinking it. I know I'm overthinking it. But this combination of rules is self-contradictory. It tells you to order things, and then it tells you to re-change the order, and it tells you the order is the way that you resolve them. I don't think that's a sensible way to write rules, and I don't think they meant them to be mutually self-referential. So, for example, this ability says the effect of the most recently used ability takes precedence, and then here in order of effects, you say we're going to rearrange which rules we consider to be recent and not recent. Instead of using the order in which they happened in time, we're going to look at whose rule they are, and then we're going to replace the order in time with that, and then we're going to use recency after we've shuffled it around. That's confusing. You would either use the player's ability, the ownership of the ability, or you would use the timestamp to figure out which ability is going first. You wouldn't use both. And I think that's the problem here. I think when they say the effects of the active players are considered to be applied more recently, they're saying, if you just ignore that and just say the effects of the active player's passive abilities take precedence over the opponent's passive abilities, and the opponent's passive abilities take precedence over the neutral abilities, just meaning that when you have to apply them, when they happen at the same moment, then you figure them out in that order. But if they don't happen in the same moment, I don't think any of this happens, right? And I think that's the confusing thing. They have to happen in the same moment, or they have to be passive abilities. So this is why this rule screws with my head so much. It says the effect of passive abilities, that's fine, are considered to be applied more recently than the effects of other abilities and rules. I don't know how to interpret this. I don't know how to change the point in time when I consider just other abilities and rules to be taking place. I don't really know what that means. If someone can explain what the point of this is to me, that would be brilliant. I understand the passive thing. I understand the modifier order, even though these things seem contradictory. I guess it does. It tells you to use tells you to apply them in order of effects, but contradictory rule says to use the most recent ability, and then order of effects tells you to reorder them. That it's a mess. It's a tangled mess of things. And it leaves me not really knowing how to apply anything. There are some things that I think are fairly straightforward, but there's a lot of rules they could make that these three rules in concert with one another don't make it clear what you can do with it. Especially when you add in, so this says the effects of passive abilities are considered to be applied more recently than the effects of other abilities and rules. You add in the effect that a lot of the rules that are other effects and rules are creating an ability that is considered to be the effect of a passive ability for the duration, and the timestamping just gets even more confusing. It gets really hard to know. So if I cast, if I cast the spell here that gives me movement 6, that creates a passive effect, right? The spell happens here, but it creates a passive effect. And then you cast a spell here that gives me movement 4, but the passive effect gets reordered because of the order of effects, so that mine is considered to be happening more recently than yours. Shit, that's a terrible 6. So my effect of my spell is happening. But passives in general happen before spells, or happen more recently, which is not before, it's actually after. Whenever it says more recently, it means after. So another way to read this is to say the effects of passive abilities are considered to happen after other effects are. which is confusing. If you have a passive ability like a 5+ ward, why would you consider it to happen after an ability if it actually happened before it? I'm totally lost. I don't think this rule matters. I don't think you need to use this bit of the rules to sort anything out. And it'd be neat to have someone explain the example that made them think, oh, we need to write a rule to handle this exception, and how that handles that exception. Because to me, I think once I started considering that we're reordering the point in time and when things are happening, and that we have 3 different rules, this contradictory effects, order of effects, and modifier order, they're 3 different rules that are telling you what order to execute things in, and they're all pretty much mutually exclusive, but there's a little bit of a hint that you use modifier order for modifiers, especially because it references order of effect. But there's no reason to think that modifier order takes precedence over contradictory effects. And contradictory effects seems to be the thing that tells you the order to use the characteristics in. And then order of effects changes it. It just confuses me so much. So I'm going to move on before the rest of the video gets stuck in this. But if you have these things figured out, if you think there's a clear way that all of these just make sense, and not just, again, like, I can interpret these in a way that's pretty straightforward. Like if I'm doing modifiers, I'm just going to use the modifier order, and I'm only going to look at order of effects when we're setting the characteristic twice. And even in that awkward scenario where like I set my movement to 6 and then my opponent uses magical intervention to set it to 4, even if that comes up, I'm probably just going to like not do that. I'm just going to have the effect of the most recent ability used. Unless, I don't know, I'm just going to give it, because I can understand like how these abilities work in practical situations. Pretty much all the time, it's not difficult in the practical situation to understand how the ability would work, and to just sort of like pick the most sensible of the contradictory rules or order of effects or modifier order so that the game still functions. But I don't know what I'm supposed to do based on the rules. I sort of understand the like idea behind some of these, especially like ordering passive effects makes sense to me. And ordering contradictory rules makes sense to me. But this line and some of the interplay between these things and with this persisting effects thing, that's confusing to me. So if somebody has an explanation for that, I'd just like to hear it. All right, we're going to move on. I think we're about halfway through. There's still a fair bit to go, although I think it'll get a bit quicker at the end. That's the sort of the hump. End of turn, we have an end of turn step. Objectives are smaller now. They're 40mm markers, and you contest them by being in combat range, so within 3 inches of the markers. So it's pretty much you have a 40mm circle and then a 3-inch radius around that. Objective score is worked out pretty well the same as it used to, except that you have some cool new terms for it. You have control score, your models have a control score, and the unit has a control score. And you want to pay attention to which, I guess the models have a control characteristic, I should say, and the units have a control score. And you have to be careful about whether the thing talks about characteristic or score. Most abilities in the game change your score. So if you have like 3 models on an objective, you'll have 3 control score on that objective because they have a control characteristic of 1 each. And then if you have an ability that's like add 1 to your control score, you'll go from 3 to 4. You won't go from 3 to 6. So just got to be careful with that. But other than that, it's very straightforward and makes a lot of sense. And you still check them at the start of the game as well as at the end of the turn, which is the same as the current edition. Advanced rules, commands. A lot of people are saying you get fewer commands. You only get fewer commands if you were playing an army before that had ways to generate extra command points. You get 4 and maybe 5 if you're the underdog, whereas in 3rd edition you get 1 for going first, maybe 2 for going second, and then you get like 1 on average from using the heroic action, like heroic leadership twice, and then you get 1 for the general being alive on your turn and 1 for the general being alive on their turn. So you get 5 if you're going second, or 4 if you're going first, which is pretty much the same here, except instead of going first or second, it's whether you're the underdog or not. The reason it feels like you have a lot fewer command points is because you have a lot better abilities to use them on. Like redeploy is better. Magical intervention is a new ability that's good. Power through is a new ability. Countercharge is a new ability. It costs 2. Like, you need a lot of command points because there's a lot of good commands and you want to be using a lot of them. And I'm in general pretty excited to see these commands used. They'll change the game a lot more than I think. Like when I was watching Haywo read battle tactics from the new GHB, and he's like, this one seems really easy. And I'm thinking, it seems easy, except given countercharge, a lot of the things that are like stand here and exist are really dangerous to do. Like your opponent could charge you, or I guess one of them is like destroying 2 units. And Haywo thought this was really easy, but it's hard to like destroy 2 units and survive. I think you had to survive as well, because your opponent can countercharge you. And like, it just means that a lot of battle tactics have a lot more counterplay, which was my initial problem with battle tactics. I think that's the biggest problem, is that they're very, very hard to counterplay because you have to counterplay all of them on your turn. You have to counterplay every possible battle tactic because they don't pick them until their turn. But having more things to do, like countercharge, gives you more, and having a better redeploy gives you more things you can do about their battle tactics. Terrain, look, I think this video is getting really long. I think I'm going to leave it there. I've got a lot to say about terrain. I think terrain's really exciting. It's my favorite thing about the new edition. So I'm not sure. I might record it and append it to this video, or I might just release it as a part 2. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there for this one because I know I've got a fair bit to say about terrain, and yeah, it's already getting a bit long. So thanks for sticking with me so far. If you know how the order of effects thing is supposed to work, I await your essay in the comments section because it's a head scratcher for me. Every time I think I've got it figured out, I spot a new problem with it and it just folds back on itself. And I'm like, I seriously, the more I look at it, the less sense it makes. So let me know what you think about that. And yeah, I'll leave it there for this one, and I'll have, sometime this week, I'll have the terrain and the rest of the core rules up. So that'll be it. Thanks for watching.